I would like to introduce our first speaker, Morgan.
Oop, sorry. All right, hi everyone. Thank you, Ashley, for putting all of this together, and thank you all for being here. I'm the AmeriCorps Resilience Fellow working at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. So I'll start off by saying that I'm not a scientist, but I do a lot of work with engagement and getting people to engage with the science, mostly working on community science and coastal flooding. But I'm here to talk today about connecting your local expertise with observations of coastal flooding. So we're just going to start off with some quick sea level rise facts. Again, I'm not a scientist, but just to kind of set the stage. As a lot of you know, sea levels are rising, and the rate at which they're rising is increasing. And there's two main drivers of the sea level rise. The first is thermal expansion. As water warms, it expands and takes up more space. And the second is the melting of land-based ice. So it's just contributing more water and contributing to global sea level rise. And this graph here is showing sea level change and the projections for the future. There's been some updates in the state. This is from the STS Maine Won't Wait technical report. So we can say that by 2050, it's going to be somewhere between, we'll say under 2 feet of sea level rise for now. And then by 2100, somewhere around 8 feet of sea level rise. How the sea level rise that we see is going to depend on our actions today and our emissions. So at GMRI, or the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, we have the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project, and the goal of this project is to answer the question, what water level and weather conditions can lead to local flooding? There are some other aims of this project. One is that community members will be out in the field recording their observations of coastal flooding and flood impacts. And then by doing this, communities are able to identify the areas in their towns that are most vulnerable to flooding and the areas that they value the most. So those are places that you would want to prioritize when you think about building a more resilient future. And this data also goes to the National Weather Service, and it improves their flood models and the timeliness of their flood alerts. And it could also be used by local decision makers. So it's just important to know what you care about. On our project website, there's a story map with different sites. You can make an observation from anywhere, but in Brunswick, we have 6 sites right now. And these are all publicly accessible places, and they're places where you can park. And as we have upcoming high water, it's a great place to get out and make observations. Then when you click on a site, you can see how you can get there and why it's considered a flood monitoring site. This is for Wharton Point, which is where we're going to be heading today to make an observation. And another goal of this project is to characterize the coast. Maine has over 5,000 miles of tidally influenced coastline and only a couple long-term tide gauges. So it's really great if we can get more observations and see how the coasts and our infrastructure are responding to these flood events. The dots here are where observations have been submitted to our project, and it spans the whole coast of Maine, but this is just, I'm just trying to capture Brunswick here. But there's a lack of observations, so it'd be great if we can start contributing to this project and contributing to this archive and seeing how it changes over time. These are just some instructions on how to get to our project page, but there'll be plenty of opportunities to get this later on, so we don't need to snag it just quite yet. And this is what our project page looks like. That story map that I was just talking about is right there on the right, and you can also learn about the scope of the project and what makes an informative observation, which I'm going to explain very briefly. So when you go and make an observation, you select the town that you're in and you put the time of your observation. You can make an observation from anywhere, but if you're at one of those 6 sites in Brunswick, you can select them from the drop-down. But if not, just feel free to type it. You say, no, I was somewhere else, and then a little description. You also pinpoint yourself on the map. And then you describe the water level and the weather conditions that you're observing. It kind of walks you through it, and it gets pretty specific, but you're able to just select like ankle deep, knee deep, just kind of going that way. And then you also take note if you see erosion or rack lines, which are areas of ocean debris which show where a previous tide reached. This is an example of erosion that was submitted to our community science page, and they added this little quote with it, and that's what I like about our data collection protocol is you're able to add your own voice and note the changes that you've seen over the years. So this one was from Falmouth. Oops. And then for those high water marks, that's great if you're making a low tide observation, which when we make our observation at Wharton Point today, the tide's going to be on its way out, but maybe we can see a high water mark there. You just want to make sure that your photos are showing where the water is relative to what you're trying to capture when we think about trying to record the same area over time. Like the one on the left, that's at the Eastern Prom in Portland. You can see there's like ocean debris in there, but it's not really helpful because we don't know where the water is, and it's not going to be a photo that we can replicate. And then also there's some optional questions when you make an observation. You can describe how the event makes you feel, and you can also come up with your own suggestions for what you think should be prioritized at this location. You can say protect, which would be like building a seawall or something, or you could suggest mending, which would be using a natural solution like living shorelines, which we're going to learn more about today, or retreating, moving away, or just conserving the area, or accommodating, which would be something like widening culverts or raising the roads. And this was an observation that someone made from Pine Point Road in Scarborough. They included a lot of information saying that they've driven by the site many times, and they also got kind of specific with it and said that 80% of the area had been eroded. And they just kind of add their local expertise to it, saying that they notice they're able to indicate the tides based on the bridge posts and everything. So stuff like that is really helpful. And then we're also heading to Wharton Point today, as I've said a couple of times. And this is where the pilot Living Shorelines project is happening. So that would be a great thing to record over time, seeing how the area is adapting, and also just this marsh ecosystem and monitoring the erosion. It's great to capture. And our project is continuing to evolve. There have been very recent updates. You're able to see how your observation pairs with real-time water level data. So you can see the actual tide time for when you made your observation. So you can kind of gauge if that was the highest tide or if you can expect higher water. And as you think about being more adaptable and resilient, this is a great tool for you to use. And this is a postcard. We had some of them up there. I don't know how many are left, but if you wanted to grab one, it just shows upcoming high water. And the circles in blue are some of the highest water of the year. So those are great times to go out and make observations. And we're in one of those periods right now. So we will see.
That's just for this year?
Just for this year. And thank you for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you want to email me, or if you want to talk to scientists, I can help connect you there. Thank you. Okay, we do have time for questions. Yes?
Could you tell us a little bit more about who's maintaining this resource? It looks like a lot of work has to be done to collate this information, and how does that work?
Yeah, so it's hosted on our Ecosystem Investigation Network, which is our community science platform. And there's a lot of projects that are like this, but they're not necessarily hosted by us at GMRI. But we partner with a lot of people and communities, like partner with Ashley, to select these sites. And it's really up to you guys to help us maintain it and make sure that the data is fresh and up to date. But yeah, so we are constantly going through and validating data and making sure that it's compliant with the project. But there's lots of different projects to take part in on our website. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you have any reporting sites in Harpswell? I noticed on your map, it looked like you didn't have data points there. It seems like that would be a good area.
That would be a good area. Yeah, we would love to include Harpswell on there. I don't believe it's on our story map right now, but if that's somewhere where people are making observations from, that's definitely a conversation we'd like to have, yeah. But yeah, anyone can, like we get observations from like Gloucester, Massachusetts too, and they're not part of the project.
Just in the spots that you indicated in Brunswick?
Yeah, you can make it wherever you want. And that's actually, we kind of prefer that because it shows places that you care about. Yes?
Have you been connecting with Friends of Casco Bay and Friends of Mary Meeting Bay on some of this? They've got a lot of information.
Yeah, I personally haven't, but I know that other people at GMRI, they work very closely with them. But yeah, I'd like to learn more about that partnership. Yes?
So observations at private residences are good?
Those are good. There's some guidelines with the project, like you can't include faces and like I wouldn't show your property or anything like that, but if you're comfortable showing where your location is on the map and like showing the impacts that you're experiencing, that's totally okay. Yeah, but you can also add that note at the bottom too, like private residence or something. And when we're thinking about taking information for our newsletters and things, we wouldn't take that out of respect.
Thank you.
Yes,
Could you put the previous slide up there on the screen?
this one?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
And could you explain what that means in terms of those blue chips?
Yeah, so about every month, there's high tides that are higher than normal. And I'm not a scientist again, but there's times that we're gonna experience higher water than usual, and that tends to be like those fall, winter months. And I think that has something to do with how close we are to the moon, to the sun. Yeah. So we experience flooding at these times. Anything else? Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm excited to make an observation with you all.
My name is Ashley Charlson. I'm the town environmental planner, and I'm the one who sent you either the letter or you saw the advertisement I created in a public place. So thanks for joining us. The next presentation will be on our Living Shorelines project, which is kind of the bulk of this workshop. Pete Slavinsky of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry is our state marine geologist, and him and I will kind of be tag teaming this presentation. All right, so just to kick off with a really brief agenda, we're going to be going over ecosystem components to erosion, how this project kind of kicked off in 2017, how it's evolved, next steps, and a few quick points about wrapping up. I won't go too much in depth because I'm about to tell you more about it now. All right, so with that said, Pete, would you like to come up and get off?
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Been working on this project for a couple of years now, so it's nice to be bringing home some information to you. So I want to start out talking a little bit about coastal bluffs, which is something that Brunswick has a lot of, and that was one of the reasons that we started this project. Their erosion is integral to providing a lot of the sediment to the adjacent habitats that we see all around the Brunswick and Casco Bay and larger Maine shorelines, including wetlands, mudflats, beaches, and other protected resources. And about 48% of our overall coastline is considered erodible bluff, and a third of that is actively eroding according to our last assessment. So I want to quickly show you how bluffs erode, and that'll give you a context as to why we did a project that looks at the toe of bluffs. Okay, so looking at a bluff here, you've got a bluff crest, bluff face, bluff toe, the intertidal habitat. And the way these things typically erode is that you got a steep bluff and undermining or erosion of that toe of that bluff. And as you can tell, that creates instability just looking at that. So what typically happens is you get what's called a landslide or a slope failure. That material kind of calves off and slides into the intertidal zone. And what you'll notice is that over time, that actually stabilizes to create a new toe to that bluff because the steep bluff has kind of naturally regraded, and that material now extends out into the intertidal zone, and it stabilizes the bluff. And over time, went the wrong way. And over time, that actually gets vegetated. So that process is actually how bluffs protect themselves from erosion and storms. They stabilize themselves by allowing material to slough off and go into the intertidal zone and stabilize the toe. The habitats adjacent to these bluffs also depend on those bluffs for erosion. They depend on them for sediment. So we wouldn't have the mudflats or wetlands that we have all in Casco Bay without erosion of those adjacent bluffs. One of the key differences between bluffs and other habitat types like beaches, dunes, marshes, is that many times we'll see marshes, beaches, and dunes reform. Bluffs erode one way, and that's landward. They don't reform in our lifetimes. So this point right here is key because that's one of the things we wanted to address in our project, which was how can we actually stabilize the toes of these by potentially stabilizing the adjacent habitats. So there are other factors that cause bluff instability. It's not just toe erosion. The majority of the sites we see are actually influenced negatively by groundwater flow. Okay, you go and you look at a bluff in the winter and you can see water pouring out of the face of it. That's a sign of groundwater coming down through the slope, through into the face of the bluff, hitting clay layers and being diverted out into the intertidal zone. We also see that heavy precipitation events can lead to surface runoff and more water coming into that face of that bluff, which again creates more instability. So having a lot of vegetation at the top of your bluff is really, really, really important. And then finally, upland land management is really important. The things we do adjacent to bluffs impacts their stability. If we have lawns with no other vegetation right to the edge of the bluff, it's not a good thing. If we have huge trees and lawn right to the edge of the bluff, it's not a good thing because there's no vegetation to really soak up rain. Surface runoff. We need to have a wide vegetative fringe of shrubs, grasses, perennials that can soak up that surface runoff at least. The placement of structures can also cause some instability, can cause surface runoff and things like that. So you end up with a supersaturated bluff. So this is an example from Great Diamond Island of what I'm talking about. You get surface runoff from that roof, which pools, and then you have this area right here eroding much faster. You also have lawn right to the edge and no vegetative fringe. Very common in what we see. So we're going to get to how it all started. It's still me. So I want to talk a little bit about living shorelines. Living shorelines is really a big term, and it is meant to really comprise a whole slew of approaches. But those approaches typically include native materials of some type. They use vegetation in conjunction with other materials, sometimes rock, sometimes wood. But the key is that they try to maintain the continuity between the land and the water, okay, as opposed to creating a barrier between those two. We'll talk about that more in a bit because it's a mistake we actually made as part of our demonstration project. This gives you an idea of the gamut of things that are called green techniques, basically on this left-hand side there, that maintain connectivity between the upland and the wetland, everything from vegetation to edging to sills to kind of a nearshore breakwater, while the things on the right are gray infrastructure. They cut off and create a barrier between habitats. They're sometimes okay at protecting property, but again, they have an impact on those adjacent habitat types because they don't allow them to move and they cut off sediment supply. So we kicked off a project back in 2018 along with the other New England states. And we all decided that we wanted to implement living shoreline demonstration projects throughout the 5 New England states, and then monitor them for a period of time. So what we're going to be sharing with you are basically that project and some of the highlights from the monitoring. So our project in Maine, we wanted to use natural materials like wood and oyster shells and test, can we stop the erosion of wetlands adjacent to bluffs, okay? So the first thing we wanted to do was we had to select some sites. These are kind of the criteria we went through. We had to have an eroding bluff or marsh, that it was representative of a larger area. It had to be owned by a project partner, in this case, the town of Brunswick. Had to have relatively easy access. It had to be a consistent shoreline for about 150 feet. It had to have an appropriate score on what we have our main geological survey living shoreline suitability score. It's a tool we've created. And it had to have some educational component where people could actually see it. So we selected 2 sites, one at Wharton Point and one at McCoy Bay Conservation Lands. So this is one of the sites that we'll actually go take a look at. This is what it looked like. This is an eroding marsh edge. We had a log that actually naturally washed into that marsh. We didn't put it there. We wanted to beneficially use that log, okay? And this is the McCoy Bay Conservation Land site. It's an eroding marsh edge. Also, you can see the slumping of the marsh, good wide mud flat, and a bluff behind it. So what we did at these sites is we used oyster shell gabions. That's what you see right here. This basket that we filled with oyster shell. And then we also used coconut fiber bags that we filled with oyster shell and kind of staked them in place. We wanted to test this biodegradable versus synthetic techniques, okay? And at McCoy Bay Conservation Lands, we did kind of the same thing, but we also wanted to integrate these things called tree runners, which are logs that sit perpendicular to the shoreline to break up ice. Because at this site, we have a lot of icing that forms during the winter. Well, we used to have a lot of ice that formed during the winter. We wanted to test those 2 techniques side by side. This is kind of what those projects looked like when we were finished. Wharton Point, you've got the log with the coconut fiber bags filled with oyster shell on top of them, next to what we call our georeef, stabilizing that edge of the marsh. And on the other side, you've got the McCoy Bay Conservation Land site, where you can see that with the georeef on the left-hand side, and then the oyster-filled bags on the right. We placed informational signage at both, so people who walked the trails or went down to the boat ramp could actually see what we were trying to do. And we're going to go on to how it's going. Ashley's up.
Just briefly, don't go anywhere. Just figured I'd give Pete a little bit of a break in speaking, just to introduce our project partners for this update. So I've already introduced myself. You've already met Pete, who is the 3rd photo in, looking incredibly excited. He always maintains this energy level and would forever be happy to answer any questions about this subject. It is his life passion. Dan Devereaux, our Coastal Resources Manager, is here as well, and he was a pivotal part of this project, as was our Marine Resources Officer and Harbor Master, Dan Sylvain, who is with Brunswick PD. All of us were volunteers on this project, and then we had hired a project consultant from GEI to help us engineer the new designs that we implemented. And I also wanted to give a really special thank you to the Town of Brunswick's Public Works Department. They took a dump truck and carted 12 cubic yards of oyster shell to Wharton Point, and we wheelbarreled it back and forth for a very long time. Dana Smith of Smith's Boatyard also helped us to float a massive barge from his business all the way to McCoy Bay Conservation Lands, also volunteer. Immense efforts that could not have made this project possible without their help. Pete, have you had a break enough time?
Thanks, Ashley.
I got more from.
And that's key. I mean, this project was built by volunteers. Yes, I'm a geologist, but I volunteered, all these folks volunteered, we built these with our hands. No heavy equipment really besides moving the shell was used. So I wanted to run through pretty quickly kind of like a timeline of what these projects looked like and how we adapted them over time, including what we did most recently, which is to adapt both of the projects pretty significantly based on the things we've been observing. So this is kind of pre-project at Wharton Point. I kind of pointed out to you the area we were looking at. this log that's been washed in place. So this eroding marsh edge is where we kind of decided to put our structure to kind of slow down erosion of the marsh so that you don't have erosion of the adjacent upland. Because again, marshes are these really, really important fringe barriers that break up significant wave energy during storm events. 50% of wave energy is dissipated by marshes within the first 25 to 50 feet of that marsh. All right, so we built this thing in 2020. And this was our original design, and this was our original construction. On the right-hand side, you can see what we call the georeef, which is the oyster-filled gabion baskets. And on the left-hand side, you can see that log. And on top of that, we kind of placed these coconut fiber-filled bags, and then this is just fiber rolls that we put on top of it. Each of those bags weighed about 35 pounds, and they were filled with oysters that were specced from a recycling program, an oyster shell recycling program down in the Portland area. So that was 2020. By 2022, our bags had pretty much been, they fell apart. The bags themselves, the twine that we used to wrap the bags was not heavy enough. It was one of the things we learned. So that was the first time we fixed it. We used different twine. The georeef was doing great. You can see it did really well. The marsh above it is doing well. The marsh above this kind of got calved off, and you can see the bags being dissipated into the intertidal, and then oyster shell falling out of the bags. So we did an adaptation to this. We left the georeef as it was, and then what we did this time is we came in and we put in Tootsie Rolls of oyster shell bags. So about 3 feet by 4 feet. And then we rolled them up and put them underneath this, and we used a different staking technique. We used different twine. We brought in these 2x4s, not pressure treated, 2x4s, and kind of staked everything, and we're like, all right, this is gonna work now. Well, it lasted a little bit. That's only a couple months. This is the 6 months. And then it started to fall apart. By 2023, this is what it looked like. So we said, all right, the bags do not work. There's too much energy. If you ever went to Wharton Point and looked out McCoy Bay, there's multiple miles of fetch that go down McCoy Bay. Waves during big storms, when they hit this, are in the 3-foot range. The 30-pound bags and the twine that hold them just wasn't enough to hold them in place. What was really interesting, though, we found was this oyster shell that had fallen out of the bags literally cemented itself in place. Like it kind of swirled around, and then the mud settled in there, and you could go on there and hop on there, and nothing would move. Yeah, like almost like shell middens, if you've ever seen them, that form over time. So what we decided to do with funding from Island Institute here was extend the georeef. We had such good success with the georeef on the right-hand side that we wanted to extend it on this left-hand side. And that's what we did. So this is a shot of the georeef in November of 2023. And it did pretty darn well over all the storms that we had in December and January of 2024. You can see all that oyster shell that we left that in place. It's kind of cemented. And the georeefs on both sides did really, really well. You'll notice a little bit of scour in front of the georeef on the right-hand side, but that scour has been there since before the project even went in. So there was a little bit more scour, but not overly too much scour. All right, McCoy Bay Conservation Lands.
You're doing good.
This is the site we chose, looking from the mud flat towards the land to give you kind of a context of what we're looking at. You're seeing the marsh edge eroding, you're seeing it all slump off into the intertidal zone, and you see the coastal bluff behind it where the tree is kind of hanging down. So this is what we did. This was, again, early 2020. We're all proud of ourselves and happy. We're taking photos. We're all excited. You can see the georeef transitioning over to where the shell-filled bags are, and we put some shell-filled bags above the georeef here because the georeef wants to be in a rectangular shape, and we had to tuck it under the trees, so it was kind of like this smushed, I don't know what kind of shape, trapezoidal shape, maybe, kind of. So there was this open space up there. This is what it looked like in 2021. Everything's holding up pretty darn well at this site. The bags aren't flying all over the place. But by 2022, those bags had failed, okay? Georeef's doing okay, but the bags had failed. And again, we saw the shell is cementing in place here. Like literally it's just falling and then the mud's getting in there and it's not moving. So this is 2022. We did a little repair, again, trying a new technique on the shell-filled bags. It failed again. This is what it looked like in 2023. Hadn't failed yet, but it will. And what we decided to do with this site, in conjunction with the town of Brunswick, with funding from the Island Institute, is to say, all right, the shell is working, so let's just pile shell along the shoreline here and see what it does. This was done in, I don't have a photo from when it was completed, but it was done in 2023 before the storms. And this is what it looked like in June of 2024. So this is after the storms had come through in December and January. So it did a pretty good job. One thing you'll notice, sorry, I have to walk away from this. I know I said I wouldn't. You saw the shell left in this area and went this way over here. Why would that be? What direction did those storms come from in December and January? Southeast. Southeast is right from here. So it was hitting and it moved the shell a little bit to the other side. But we're very, very pleased actually with how this held up over time. All right, lessons learned. Whew. Is this me or you?
I think it should be, yep, okay, yeah, so
Okay.
I think it's still technically you, but I can just go ahead and read from the slides. Pete, like I said, very passionate. So yeah, just to go over a few of the lessons learned and adaptations that Pete, you basically already kind of covered a little bit in the last slides. But the failure of those core bags, the deflection of wave action adjacent to the shore, and just continued improvements regarding what type of materials we choose. So with the biodegradable product tested, the twine, as Pete mentioned, was not adequate for holding down the bag. So once it gets wet, it stretches. And also, you love biodegradable materials, but they are built to biodegrade. So we can't entirely be mad or surprised that they failed, as Pete mentioned. So with the biodegradable bags, though they're easy to work with, they're too light to hold up to big storm events. Biodegradable bags, even when held in place, will fall apart generally after 2 years or less, which is what we found. And we also implemented adaptable biodegradable Tootsie Rolls, as Pete mentioned, with new staking approach, also determined to be unsuccessful in a highly energetic environment such as MBCL, or McCoy Bay Conservation Lands. Concerning the synthetic and log products we tested, the Tensar Georeef, which were those big black kind of mesh-looking bags, especially at Wharton Point, where the baskets were filled with shell to create that rectangular shape, that appeared to hold up the best in terms of shape, stability, and its ability to hold shell and withstand degradation. With the Tensar Georeef at McCoy Bay Conservation Lands, it could have been filled with more shell to help retain that shape, but it's very difficult to do under the log runners, as Pete mentioned, which is why we kind of pivoted to just dumping shell. So with that shore parallel log at Wharton Point, it might not have been high enough to efficiently break up that wave energy so close to the installation. And the shore perpendicular log runners at McCoy Bay Conservation Lands alternatively seem to be performing really well. So as far as future recommendations go, definitely altering our future attachment to tree runners using duckbills in the future so that those logs don't move as much. And then with monitoring, photo documentation has been the best source of monitoring for us. I think our plan moving forward will probably be to establish some kind of consistent photography, maybe using a drone and standing in specific locations, I don't know, maybe once a week, once every other week, something just to establish a consistent photographic evolution of how it's holding up. Detailed biological and vegetative monitoring have also have not shown any significant changes and are extremely labor intensive and likely shouldn't be implemented unless significant planting is part of a project. Accessibility has been a key factor in being able to obtain good monitoring data, especially during the winter months. So it's likely that we'll be exploring future test sites as new methods come about. But as Pete mentioned, having regular access is very important to this project, obviously. Monitoring will continue to assess the success of this project and inform any future adaptation measures that we pursue. So, with next steps, let's see, I'm gonna take a quick sip.
Can I do this?
This is technically you.
I know.
You want me to do it? I got it. Alrighty. So, as Pete mentioned, we've been kind of considering new test projects that we want to pursue. So if we were doing something similar as it pertains to this project, at both sites we would likely want to test placing near shore sill at the mudflat. So you can kind of see where that, what would you call that? Just like a...
That's like the low marsh mudflat interface.
Yeah, so the location of where that kind of what is that, like the black
It's just a
mesh?
Design.
Hatch design, okay.
And that's where I would put the GeoReef in the future.
Yeah,
because-
I was trying to figure out how to describe that, but,
because we put the project back where that log is. And remember I talked about trying to maintain maintain continuity between the upland and the wetland? We actually put a barrier between the two wetland types. So I should feel like I should just start rapping or something. And so I think one lesson we learned from this is really if we want to maintain that continuity between the wetlands, we would put the nearshore sill out at the mudflat low marsh interface and then allow the low marsh to kind of integrate with the high marsh naturally, so that there's a natural slope and a natural connectivity between those two instead of putting a barrier there. So we kind of did something against what we already said we shouldn't do, but we learned from it that this really is how you should try to address this problem. This is much more complex in terms of permitting. That's important to point out. But one of the lessons learned is this is what we want to try next. Sorry.
all right. We have also seen a lot of new innovative nature-based solutions in other towns implemented in locations like Blue Hill, which is the photo on the left, and one at Sebago Lake State Park on the right, using old, I believe it is Christmas trees. Is it? Oh wait, no, that was at Scarborough.
Nope.
So, do you want to just do
Yeah,
the
I'll
last
talk
three
about these.
slides?
Yeah, I'll
and
talk
then
about
it's all
these. Then you
me?
can. Yeah. All right, sorry. So on the left-hand side is a 1,500 feet of eroding bluff in Blue Hill that a property owner said, I don't want to put down riprap. I want to test living shoreline techniques. So what they did on this one is, this is really cool. They took a really steep bluff and graded it back, which is what we always recommend in cases where you have a really steep bluff, because that's what nature wants to do anyway. And then what they did is they built this intertidal sill using logs and put ballast stone in there. So you see the scattered stone, that's to break up ice. They planted that with low marsh wetland vegetation. Then you see a tier of rocks where you go up in elevation. That's other vegetation types. And then as you go up the face of the slope, they planted bluff-specific native vegetation, which is helping stabilize the face of this bluff. And it's performing really, really well. On the right-hand side is a test project at Sebago Lake State Park, if you've ever been there. These are what we call root wads. Sitting out here, they're trees stuck in. And then those are just called branch mattresses that are in place. And they're literally there to, number one, break up ice, and number two, to catch sand. Okay. There are a lot of new techniques that are coming to Maine also. This is something from Cape Cod where there was an eroding coastal bluff. It's a sandy bluff. It's not a clay bluff like what we have here, but the techniques would be the same. And what this consultant did is they went in and they actually helped stabilize the toe of this by putting coconut fiber rolls base there. And you'll see the stone they also put in, the couple big stones to kind of help break things up. And then they regraded that slope and stabilized it with native vegetation. And that's what it looked like a couple years later on the lower right. So some of these techniques also are transferable to Maine and could be used. All right, back to Ashley. Thanks.
Also, apologies for drinking out of a plastic water bottle as your environmental planner, but I promise I have reused this at least 50 times. Alrighty, so thank you, Pete. Finally, the slides I have prepared. All right, so the town of Brunswick is starting to engage in efforts and initiatives to help protect its bluffs and natural resources. So obviously you just heard quite a bit about the pilot project to install georeef runner logs at Wharton Point and McQuay Bay Conservation Land. But the town of Brunswick is also engaging in building its climate action plan, which you've probably seen a number of posters around town. We're getting towards the end of that process, so I'll have a few updates about that towards the end. But essentially, this work has been designed to help develop alternatives to hard armoring, and the armoring does not necessarily allow the migration of sediment to the adjacent wetlands, as Pete kind of mentioned. So, long story short, the work is really important because it helps to identify uses and less impactful alternatives that are better for coastal habitats and hard armoring. Data from this would likely be used by the town to present coastal landowners with different alternatives to armoring the shore with impermeable structures. Let's see. But I'll get more into that as it relates to climate action planning in just a moment. So just to take it back for a second, I'm sure you've all seen a lot of what's happened in the past few years, especially with storm damage, not only in our town, but across the U.S. We're experiencing intense heat waves, sea level rise, coastal erosion, declining water quality, changing economic opportunities and ecosystems with invasive species. Like I said, kind of a few times during this presentation, increased precipitation and storm intensity, which has obviously led to a lot of destruction around the coastline and coastal inland flooding. So as a way to address these issues and help protect our town, its resources, our community, et cetera, we've started to engage in this climate action planning process. So with the help of the Greater Portland Council of Governments, the town, myself facilitating that, and our Climate Action Task Force, which is a local town committee that's composed of experts in their field that are residents here as well. We've been collecting a lot of community input to build this plan. And in the long run, it's meant to help us develop strategies to reduce town-wide emissions, but not only that, to reduce or to build resilience and prepare for the inevitable impacts of climate change that we see on a seasonal basis. We also want to support community goals and protect economic development, reduce vulnerability, and create a healthier, more sustainable Brunswick. So, in case you're not familiar, I think we're all generally familiar with what it means to experience vulnerability. But when I say resilience, I refer to the capacity of communities and systems or individuals to adapt and recover quickly from climate change related impacts. So to take it back to what this presentation was focused on originally, if we're talking about erosion in the context of climate change, we can see how the impacts of global warming, such as increased storm intensity, frequency, sea level rise, et cetera, directly contributes to the vulnerability our coastal community experiences. And this Living Shorelines project is just one of the many ways that we are working to enhance the resilience of our natural systems in order to protect both the ecosystem and our community. This is just a very high-level look at some of the draft strategies and actions that will be included. We're getting towards the end of the climate action planning process, and I would say probably within a month have a full draft of the plan and a full list of what's available, which what's listed here is probably 2% of everything that's listed. This plan covers everything from not only municipal operations, but transportation, buildings and housing, energy, obviously natural resources, which includes what people classically think of natural resources, like trees, marine systems, harvesters, things like that, but food systems and land use management, as well as public health and waste. Waste and waste management is the last one. But as it pertains to this presentation, I just wanted to highlight some of the ones that would directly support exploring similar work as we described in this presentation. So one of the strategies would include protecting, restoring, and conserving wetland, coastal, and riverine habitat quality and connectivity. And some of the actions that we would then pursue in order to attain that would be considering and exploring initiatives to prevent wetland habitat loss and facilitate tidal wetland migration. More so related to living shorelines, we would like to improve watershed, stormwater runoff, and coastal bluff management practices. So that could look something like providing educational opportunities to residents to help understand how, obviously you can't control the impact of the weather in your own backyard, but we can adjust our practices and land management actions in order to reduce the impact of climate change on the environment, because it's getting a lot of different stress from many different sources. Let's not be one of them. So another thing we could do is consider ordinance amendments to improve coastal bluff management. And obviously with ordinances, that would of course go through town council process and have time for public input, et cetera. So if you see language related to pursuing or considering ordinance updates, just know the plan itself is not necessarily a legally binding document. It's just meant to be an aspirational guide, and there will be plenty of opportunity for public input throughout every step of the way. And lastly, we would consider exploring nature-based alternatives concerning shoreline stabilization projects. So creating the mechanisms with which, after we've tested them and figured out what's the most effective, that's great, but how do we make those resources available to you? That's something that we would consider researching further. And I'm not going to go over this diagram in depth. It's more so to say, feel free to take a look at this. There will be a link to the recording of this afterwards. But this just kind of highlights all of the reasons why this kind of nature-based solution work is beneficial not only to you who want to obviously protect your home, your family, your resources, but also to protect your environment and show us how we can be a steward in a more cooperative capacity with our environment. And lastly, I would just like to emphasize that once the climate action plan is finalized, it'll go through a public comment process, and whether or not you agree with certain aspects of it, we want the feedback, all of it. So if you support this kind of work especially, you will have a chance to show that you support this and encourage the town council to either make sure things like this are included, or obviously voice your concern and opinion if you see something you don't like. But I just want to really nail it down that community perspective is key to identifying what themes, actions, and strategies this plan should or should not include and prioritize. So if you don't give us your input, we don't know how best to serve you, and we want to know. So with that, we are wrapping up, and we are so ahead of schedule. Good for us. All right, so just a few quick things. I want to, again, give a really quick shout out to the Island Institute, who was our major funding source, and by major, I mean entire funding source for this, other than our volunteered time. So it's a really, really great organization that does a lot to support not only nature-based adaptation solutions for similar projects, but they support a lot of coastal communities and people and groups of folks that are experiencing vulnerability due to related climate hazards. So if you've not heard of them or haven't checked them out, I strongly recommend you check out their website. It's islandinstitute.org. And just check out some of the really great projects that they're pursuing statewide. They're a 10 out of 10 organization. If you haven't yet, I would also recommend you sign up with your name and email address with the sign-in sheet over by the door so that you can be notified when future workshops occur, what resources are available, et cetera. Never miss an opportunity, especially if this is something that really interests you. I promise I won't spam you with anything else. And concerning the field trip to Wharton Point, I guess we could probably leave early or obviously wait until we go through the question period, but just a few quick notes about that. When we leave this room, I would recommend you take all of your stuff with you because we don't have access to it after about 4:30, 5 o'clock. So please take all your belongings with you. I would also, if you attended with a few people, I would recommend carpooling. If you're not familiar with Wharton Point, it's got a very small parking lot, and that curve can be a bit of a speed trap. So just be careful with parking. And Dan, it's like maybe 6 or 7 spots in that entire lot. So really, really recommend that you carpool if possible. And just be mindful of the fact that we will be going out and stepping out in the environment. So if you're a little unsure as to whether or not you'd be comfortable in that kind of environment, we will be recording that segment as well. You are, of course, welcome to join because it's really cool to see these installations firsthand. But if that's not your vibe, we will have a link and you will be able to see it recorded instead. And stay in touch. We're so happy that you were able to join us, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and listen to us scream into the mic. So thank you. And with that, Pete and I will take questions. Yeah.
The photo of Blue Hill
Yes.
and that bluff mitigation project, do you know what direction the wind and water hits that bluff?
Yes, it's actually in a salt pond area, so it's more sheltered. The fetch is fetch is the distance over which over that wind can blow over water. It's maybe 3/4 of a mile as opposed to 6 or 7 miles up McCoy Bay. So it's different from that standpoint.
I was just wondering if you had any observations about what type of mitigation best holds up under extreme stress, or just, whether it's a...
Yeah, it's hard to say there's one that's best. It all depends on what the exacerbating factors are in terms of the erosion. Some of the erosion we see along the bluffs are all toe erosion due to undercutting. In that case, you want to break up some of the wave energy that's getting to it. That could be through the nearshore sill. That could be through a nearshore sill with a larger marsh. That could be a toe stone structure that goes across. Sometimes that toe stone has to go up the face of the slope a little bit. Usually, though, there's also a really steep slope associated with the bluff also. And a lot of these sites, one of the best ways to make them more stable is to regrade them. But that means you're going to be losing land. So you're going to have to take something that's like this and go back like this. You could lose, 20 or 30 feet at the top in order to do that sometimes.
You couldn't add to the toe by bringing in more material?
That would be considered fill of the intertidal zone under Maine DEP regulations. So you can to an extent, but then you have to start paying fees.
Paying fees?
Yep, mitigation fees for filling the intertidal zone. Yep, so that's considered a habitat impact. So all those projects that we did, that was considered fill of the intertidal zone because we put structures in the intertidal zone. Up to a certain point, you can do that. Once you get beyond a certain point, you have to pay what's called an in lieu fee to the in lieu fee program in Maine. So it's considered damage to the intertidal zone. So then you have to pay a fee.
So, that's a good
Dan.
question, Mark.
Dan?
Oh, sorry. That was actually a really good question, because one of the reasons, I think, when we initially started was because the permitting processes are easier actually to do hardscape and armoring versus a large scale where you're filling with shell or trees or natural materials, because that's a harder permitting process, which is frustrating. But a great question, and hopefully the more that we learn about this, the more we can inform those regulatory agencies to say, okay, you know, now we know that this may work, or this does work in this situation, and we're just starting to learn. It's 2017, so it's a 7-year project that's monitored over a long term. So we're just starting to learn a lot of the characteristics that would require different applications that would allow that transport and save the marsh. So hopefully, over time, we can inform our older regulations to sort of promote this type of activity versus hardscape. Go ahead.
Oyster shells seemed like a brilliant idea. I wish that there was more data on how to keep them there or just add to them.
Yeah, so the oyster shells all came from a recycling program in Portland.
EcoMaine.
EcoMaine had all the oyster shell available to us. And you know, the big thing we initially thought was, how do we keep them in place? And that's why we tested the bags, which were biodegradable. The thing we learned with the biodegradable is if you're not planting it with vegetation to help stabilize it, it's not going to necessarily work. You can't just put biodegradable materials in the intertidal zone and expect it to stay there. It's too energetic, it freeze thaws, et cetera, et cetera. But the oyster shells themselves, you know, there are some states that have entire recycling programs that then take those oyster shells and they build gigantic reefs with those. Actually, they just take them and dump them in the water. And then they have such high natural colonization from oysters that within a couple of years they have a whole oyster reef. I'm not the oyster guy, so I can't tell you if that would happen. The problem, we thought we would actually see some oysters and other shellfish colonizing on our georeef or along the shoreline. It's too high in the intertidal zone. The tide goes too far out. In the winter, everything we get, I'm sure something survives in the summer, but come winter, everything freezes. And they can't withstand that. So possibly something farther out might work, but the tide range in McCoy Bay is so big and it's so flat.
The durability
Oh.
and stability of the oyster shells themselves in terms of being able to stay there, to stay in place.
Yeah, we were surprised by that, how well they cemented together, and then the mud kind of formed the cement. And yeah, I mean, it's you know, some people would consider big piles of oyster shell against a bank unsightly. Other people don't mind it. Some people really like the look of the georeef. Other people hated it. So it's like, you know, everybody is going to have a pro and con for each of these things.
But that's all part of the test methods. And I just wanted to add something really quick before we stray too far away from it. Part of what comes along with testing new methods is obviously not only figuring out what works and figuring out if there is a demand for it, but if both of those things exist, what we would do as part of that process is also figure out how to make it easier and more accessible for folks. So working with the state government to maybe figure out, I don't know, some kind of more effective permitting process. You know, I'm just kind of talking with suggestions and ideas at this point, but that is some degree of what's specified in the plan is, you know, figuring out what works, what you want to see, and then making it accessible to you. It wouldn't necessarily just be something like okay, you can only stabilize your shorelines with these natural materials. Oh, sorry, it's your problem to pay those really high fees. We would work to make it a much easier process. That was sarcasm for anyone watching online. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to
When you
say,
easier, I would hope accessible by homeowners to be able to afford this.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at. You summarized it a little more succinctly.
Well, I get that, because we looked at riprap for our area 20 years ago, and it was cost prohibitive, and now it's gotten worse, the problem has gotten worse. And, I'm more concerned about what to do with it.
I think a lot of pieces have to be in place. So like Pete mentioned, there are 2 states remaining, coastal states remaining, that do not have shell recycling programs, Maine and Alaska. So it's our job to push to have some sort of subsidized shell recycling program so we can get the shell in. We know that it helps buffer acidity. We know that they settle and perform really great. And if you get an opportunity to go to McQuaid and look at the Wharton Point project, you will see. You could play basketball on the shells down there. They're so hard and compacted.
Yeah.
So, there needs to be a lot of other things that come to place before we're ready to, do backup dump trucks to salt marshes and dump oyster shells.
Yeah.
So,
The only other thing I wanted to add on this topic real quick is the state knows that permitting for these projects is very, very difficult. Having gone through it myself, I had to apply for a permit for these projects. And there have been a lot of discussions on how to make permitting easier for living shoreline projects that have minimal impact, make permitting easier for projects that have softer solutions or green-gray / hybrid solutions.
Yeah, not just oyster shell.
Yeah, not just oyster shell. And there's actually a document that's being developed by Maine DEP right now called Our Shore. I can't tell you what the acronym stands for, but it includes an entire process of understanding vulnerability, going through decision support tree, looking at different options and providing examples and case studies from around the state and around the country as to how you can apply these different types of techniques to a shoreline. We also have a coastal property owner guide that the Maine Geological Survey has written. Look it up. It includes all the different habitats in Maine. It's a pretty good resource.
Is that linked on the website?
No.
Website?
I don't know,
We should.
possibly.
We'll figure out
And
how
then
to get those to you.
And then there's a bunch of other resources that are available. And the state also recognizes that funding for these projects is also difficult. There are no funds right now to help private property owners develop their own projects. There are some unique ways that maybe some homeowner associations and other organizations can come together to apply for some certain funds, but there is no fund right now in the state that would help these projects.
But if you tell us that you want to pursue projects like that, and by pursue, tell me by commenting on the climate action plan, if we get those actions included, it kind of opens up the door and shows other agencies how serious and dedicated we are to exploring and expanding those kind of services. And it opens up the door for more funding, or at least brings attention and brings more people talking and coming together to solve the issue. But I just want to pause there and see, is there anyone else who had a different question? I'll get to you, don't worry, we've got extra time. Yeah.
Right, the question is, as a DIY, do-it-yourself type homeowner, and what we seem to think is the most attractive way to do this, and probably the less labor-intensive way to do this, is Cape Cod approach,
Pete, are you familiar?
with the natural grass.
Oh,
the
yes.
natural-
Can you repeat the question in your neck?
Yeah, the gentleman was asking about the example I provided from Cape Cod. And we actually have Tim, do you want to talk about that? Do you know more about that one than I do? I just know it's a,
That's it. It's a more
Yeah.
natural approach that has a
What-
different kind of vegetation to hold back the landmass
yeah.
at
So-
the angle you want to put it at.
Yeah, there's also engineering associated with this that you don't see anymore.
And substrate
Yeah.
differences.
But the idea
But-
is generally, the end product here is what we want.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
So the bottom line is that if we could manufacture a way to use local vegetation and get a good pitch, just to kind of recover the areas that were washed away, and if we grow and take hold, it would give you that look.
Yeah,
And
that's,
that's what I would like, as opposed to all these other ways that you introduced. For us to do that, permitting would be to the local town permitting office, correct?
We don't know, but we're still kind of exploring those options, but
That option is probably the only way I'd like to see it. But we're kind of on our own, it sounds like, if we don't have, we're kind of lost in the woods, but we like that look.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I will say in some cases, this look won't work everywhere.
Yeah, I understand, but I think in the DIY project that I'm looking at now, probably would. And it's only like 200 to 300 feet of shoreline.
Yeah.
And it's manageable. And physically, the labor part of it could be done by using, local soils that would be, that would work with this, and local plants that would work with this. And I'd like to try it, to see in an area that spot, to see if it would take hold the land back, and give us that look, that nice look off the shoulder.
I'm glad you feel that way, because there are actions in the Climate Action Plan that we intend to pursue that is basically exactly what you're describing. So when that becomes available,
And it's in Brunswick, too.
what is?
The project that I'm thinking of
Okay.
is in Brunswick. So that's why I came to the meeting, to see if there was something that would look good and hold the bank and hold the weather.
Well, this is just one example. Like I said, we're going to pursue more options. This isn't going to be, one size fits all, as Pete was explaining. There is going to be a lot of, I'll let you talk in a second. There will be a lot of different situations where, what we pursued with the oyster shell wouldn't work somewhere like maybe your
I'm
backyard.
interested in just the general looks of it, but the idea is that if we're successful, there's plenty of places around here that would probably come.
100%. Did you want to?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name's Tim Forrester. I'm a wetland scientist and environmental consultant with a firm called Flycatcher in Yarmouth. I've been working on coastal projects specifically for about 15 years, working with Pete on stuff, and I know Seth Wilkinson quite well. Gave a presentation and used a bunch of his slides last month. And I've been to this site and I've seen a lot of the stuff that he does, and I'm trying to incorporate that more into the work that I do. But yeah, it is a great system, and Pete makes a really solid point that it's not suited for everywhere. But in a lot of cases, you can hybridize something like this. The real struggle is at the toe of the slope at the highest annual tide. The core of this stuff are their core log rolls, and this is in a sand dune environment where you establish those rolls, you add in dune grass in between the rolls, and the root structures will get in there. They may snap off in the winter or in a storm, but the base of the roots are already well embedded in the core material, so it works great. He has a patent on how it's installed. So,
Any question about that?
yeah, sure.
Last question, and then we're going to move to someone new.
Padding is put right on the surface of the basically the soil base that you're trying to put in. And the roots will penetrate into there and hold the thing in place, correct?
In general, yeah. There's a lot of work to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can
But it is a great system. So.
All righty, great. Other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering how the perpendicular logs are held in place. Do they have to be, how you can't just lay them on the ground?
Well, so you started with the logs. Those logs, I have mixed feelings about them. Pete, maybe you should take
So
it.
the logs are, it's actually a technique borrowed from stuff that's used on the Great Lakes to break up ice. But they're attached perpendicular with what are called duckbill anchors. You can buy them well, these are huge duckbill anchors, but they literally, it's like it sounds. It's an anchor that you pound into the ground, and then you literally pull on it and it opens. And it opens and it catches inside the soil, in this case the clay, and you cannot pull it out. It has like a 3,000 pound holding capacity. And what you do is then you screw lag bolts into the top and bottom of the logs, and it holds it in. If I were doing this project again, a lesson learned was you should use 2 of the anchors, and then if this is the log, and then anchor 1 and 1 and pull it taut. And then 1 and 1 and pull it taut instead of just 1 and 1, because that allows the log to rotate and stuff like that.
All right, we've got time for maybe 2 more quick questions. Yeah.
So when you look at the work at Cape Cod and you think like, okay, this job is done, but it's not. I mean, everything you've done is really temporizing, right? Because the sea level is still rising.
Yes. So
what's plan B?
well, that's a great question. living shorelines or nature-based solutions are what I call, like literally it's a garden in front of you, but you have to tend to it. And with changing climate, with sea level rise, with storms, everything we put in place along the coast is going to have to undergo adaptive management. Everything. You build a riprap wall, it's going to fail over time. You build a bulkhead, it's going to fail over time. You're going to have to maintain those too. Same thing with living shorelines. Adaptive management is really, really important. We've been adapting these things for a couple of years now. But the whole idea on maintaining some of the continuity of the landscape, I think is really important because our natural features for millennia have been moving landward in response to sea level rise. We're going to have to remember that that is going to continue whether we want it to or not. So we can slow it down. We can make it so that it's manageable, but it's still going to continue in our lifetimes. So adaptive management is very, very important. And the benefit of a living shoreline is it maintains that connectivity and it allows these habitats to kind of transfer up the landscape.
Do you have another point? I'm going to have to pay you an hourly rate at this point.
So another great advantage to doing something like this is the core logs are actually well down below. They're actually a secondary layer to what happens here. And then sand and vegetation is applied over the top. So when a storm comes in, maybe you'll have some damage to the toe. And maybe that first or second row of core logs will be exposed for a short period of time. And yes, you're going to have to come back in, maybe add more plants, maybe add more sand. But you're having an organic line of defense inside of the vegetative layer out front.
I think something that might be more aligned with Maine is probably more so like what you'd see at Blue Hill. I mean, obviously we have sandy beaches further south, but as Pete said, you need to do what works with the natural environment. So, you know, planting a bunch of seagrass in an area that's almost entirely rocks, you know, it's going to fail and you're just going to waste money. So,
yeah. And the other thing that I would definitely say, we're focusing a lot on the erosion at the toe. The easiest thing I would say for coastal property owners is address the upland. Address your upland. Get rid of your lawn to the edge of the bluff. Plant a 10 to 20 foot vegetative fringe. There's a coastal planting guide that's out there that the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District put out that's specific to bluffs in Maine. It details all the different vegetative types, how they should be applied, where they should be applied. Having a vegetative fringe at the top of your bluff, if you have a bluff, is one of the most important things you can do. And if you have evidence of groundwater saturating the face of your bluff, get an engineer to take a look at it and have them put in French drains or something that helps drain the face of the bluff. You can even do rain gardens. Just catch the water before it gets into the face of the bluff. That's what leads to failure.
not only figuring out what plants work in the specific environment, but substrate tests to figure out like what kind of vulnerability your property might be subject to. I don't remember what the address was, but there was a pretty massive kind of mini landslide following, what was it, by Buttermilk Cove? Princess Point. So it was a really like clay-based substrate, and they didn't realize how saturated the ground was getting, and it just went after all of those storms that we had this winter. And so now they're kind of emergency repairing mode, which is scary, and I would imagine is probably why a lot of you are here to figure out what you can do to protect your homes. And we are working on not only testing new methods, but compiling those resources for you. Did you have a question, or did Pete answer it?
Pete answered it, but to the extent that the town of Brunswick could put that on the website or make that linked resource accessible, that is, as you said, Pete, the first line of defense. And I'm afraid there are a lot of pressures on landowners to keep cutting down to the shore. And it's worse and worse as you go through town. So
Pressures in some instances. There's also a lack of education necessarily. Some people might not understand what the full impact of that decision would be. So without having that kind of all-encompassing understanding of what actions you take and their subsequent impacts could be, you know, you're basically just kind of blind to the impact. One more quick question before we start to head out, if anyone's got one. Yeah.
Would it be worth compiling filing landowners' properties for different situations. For instance, we have a lot of ledge, so that you could test different scenarios on, I'd be happy to volunteer property, to have be a test property, for a particular situation. Is it worth inventorying and seeing if people are willing to have their properties used in a test situation?
Yeah, so those are also options. I keep plugging the climate action plan. Sorry?
Could you repeat the question? It's hard to hear back here.
So do you want to just rephrase that a little more?
Just would it be worth for the town to inventory properties based on different erosion situations
So-
to see if you could do testing on it?
Thank you. Inventorying property types and like land types so that we could figure out options to test different methods and where they might be effective to test. So that's, this was an example, or this project that we just pursued with the oyster shell and the living shorelines is just one example of testing something like that. But once we, reach out to more organizations and figure out new methods to test, those would be the next steps. We're just not there yet, but we're working on it.
Okay, the only thing I would add to that is the condition of the shoreline in Brunswick has been recently mapped. Dan, when did we redo that? 2020?
Yeah, 2019.
We went out and actually remapped the coastal bluffs in Brunswick, so you have more updated maps. So the maps were from 2002. So that assesses the stability of the bluff. So if you look up Maine Geological Survey coastal bluff maps, it tells you whether it's a stable bluff, an unstable bluff, or a highly unstable bluff, and then it tells you the adjacent habitat. Is it a ledge? Is it a wetland? Is it a mud flat or a sand flat? Or is it armored? So the inventory from that standpoint is done, but that's a wonderful idea that maybe the town would want to potentially work on.
It's in the climate action plan. Everything that you could possibly think of in order to help you figure out what you need to remediate any of the stresses or impacts that you're experiencing due to climate change, there is something in there for everyone that we are trying to address. So it's our way of saying we see you, we hear you, and we are working on it, and we look forward to cooperating with you in more capacities like this in the future. So thanks again for joining.
What's the best way to get to the climate action plan?
So if you wrote down your email, if everyone is fine with it, I would obviously be happy to add you all to that email blast. I have kind of like an outreach update system that I engage in when there's major new updates concerning the plan. It'll also be posted all over the website. If you walk into town hall, I'll probably have a flyer in each bathroom each bathroom stall. I'm not kidding. It was the most effective way to get feedback. Because I know you all sit there for at least a minute. Anyway, it will be publicly available. We kind of plaster signs all over highly frequented local businesses. We share it on our town social media pages. We have a Facebook and an Instagram that we share it on. We also had the road signs flashing for notifications for the climate action workshops that we had. So it'll be very apparent when it's ready to go, because I very much enjoy the transparency of engaging the community, whether or not you agree with me or not. My job as the town environmental planner is to figure out how to find comparable and ways to compromise in order to help you as well as the environment. So that's our goal, or mine at least. So with that, we are going to head out and depart for Wharton Point. If you're not familiar with it, I would say use Google Maps and carpool if possible, but I believe I think it's searchable as the Wharton Point boat launch. So again, carpool if possible, take all your stuff, grab some food, please and thank you, and feel free to grab a business card and reach out if you have any more questions. Thanks.
All right, hi everybody. I was not presenting at the library, but my name is Sienna Zuko and I'm the Climate Services Project Manager. I work at Global Community Research Institute. I work really closely with Morgan. We're a part of the Municipal Climate Action Program. And so a lot of work entails working with coastal communities like Brunswick around things like climate change, coastal flooding, silver eyes, all that good yet bad stuff. And so a lot of our work focuses on the Community Science Project, which Morgan presented on at the library. And so what we wanted to do today, as you know, since we're all coming down here and taking the opportunity to look at the Living Shorelines project at Morton's Point, we wanted to talk about the coastal flooding protocol, the collection of data that we kind of talked about at the library in a little bit more depth, and give folks a chance to ask any questions or things like that. And again, like Morgan said, even though today we're using this as an opportunity to kind of collect an observation at Morton's Point, obviously it's not very stormy today. It's a beautiful sunny day. But the goal of this project is to look at, again, what weather conditions and sea levels lead to local flooding, but also what kind of impacts does that local flooding cause. Which is why we talked a lot about erosion and coastal bluffs today. And so I'm just going to kind of point through this real fast, and folks can reach out and ask me questions, and I'll come around with the mic so we capture them. But so yeah, for the first question, you'll see where to, when, what time. This is where we're kind of marking the date, where we are, all that good stuff. And again, you can always do this anywhere else. It doesn't have to be here. It doesn't have to be at any of the sites that are listed online. You could do it anywhere. And if your preference is just to kind of collect information and you don't really want to put it on the online database, you can email it to us and we'll upload that observation for you. Going on down to describing the current water level, like Morgan said, it's pretty broad. It's just kind of like using your best judgment. We go through the data afterwards and validate it to make sure that it feels accurate based on what pictures are provided, all that good stuff. So you'll see things like no flooding. So for today, we would probably say no flooding. And then we go into things like maybe there's some wave splash over, or maybe flooding is up to like ankle deep, all that good stuff. We also have questions around observing high water marks, which are those black lines that Morgan was mentioning, and showed some pictures that served as examples. And also any signs of erosion, which I think at this place especially is really great and important to capture as we're documenting things like the Living Shorelines project to help understand, like Ashley said, photos are the best way to understand and monitor how a project is going. And that's the same with something like this, can be really helpful with capturing and documenting photos and getting that larger picture context of what's happening. And then as we go down, we're talking about weather conditions. So is it rainy? Is it super windy? Those kinds of things. And then when you flip over to the next page, that's when you're prompted to look a little bit about the waves, right? So it's not just sea level rise, but it's that storm surge. It's those strong waves that can also cause damage, erosion, flooding. And then we prompt some pictures or photos. And then that's kind of the end of what's required of you if you want to submit an observation. It just kind of goes into asking questions about your role in your community, what kind of concerns you might have about flooding, what solutions you're interested in. And again, like Morgan said in her presentation, capturing this information is extremely helpful for local municipal officials to understand what community members are most worried about. So that's also why it's really important to not stick with what is kind of listed already for Brunswick, but going around to other places that you might value in the area, including in places like Harpswell, right? Someone mentioned Harpswell was a place of interest. Yeah, so that's kind of all of the big stuff. And I just wanted to open up any time for questions. All of this protocol is online, but we wanted to have a paper version because obviously we're outside, not in front of a screen today. But yeah, I just want to open up to any questions people might have about how to answer them, or yeah, anything like that.
You mentioned tide staff. Could you describe what is a tide staff?
That's a great question. So most people probably don't have a tide staff, but it's kind of just a way of measuring where the tide is at when you're in the field. It's certainly not a requirement for this kind of thing. That's why we have ways of collecting that information based on, you know, when you're looking at it, does it look maybe it's about ankle deep? Is it about up to a foot? And when we ask these questions, it's kind of relative just to your general knowledge of the space or the area, right? We know that people aren't maybe visiting this at every tide level at every time. So again, just using your best judgment to understand where the water level might be. So if we're thinking about today for context, right? There's not really a lot of flooding, but if we're having one of those extreme high tides, those king tides that we kind of talked about a little bit in the presentation, that's going to mean that when you're looking at relative to where the water is right now, which we're coming off of a high tide, and then let's say the water is like all the way up to the parking lot, right? that's a significant amount of flooding that we want to document. So again, that's why we ask for those also larger pictures, so you're capturing it within the context of what's happening around you. So Brenda's question was, are there any places that we're really looking for a lot more observations? And so I believe what Morgan showed in her presentation is that we have a huge lack of data and observations from the Brunswick-Harpswell area, which is crazy because, like we said, there's 5,000 miles of tidally influenced coastline. And so what it looks like in Portland, where we have a lot of observations, definitely not going to look the same up here. We also only have 4 tide gauges across the state of Maine, which is also pretty wild just because, or there's more than 4 tide gauges, but they're very minimal and they're very sparse. And again, we have 5,000 miles. That's a lot of coastline. And so again, just capturing more data, getting out there is really helpful. And the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, during the fall season, we'll be hosting some coastal meetups. I'm not sure if we'll be doing any in Brunswick, but we're starting to plan that out in those events over the course of the fall to get more people out there in times when it's not necessarily the sunny kind of lower tide day, but actually on the ground when there's some really great instances of flooding that are worth documenting and capturing. Feel free to hold on to these, and if you want, as we're walking about today and Pete's kind of talking about all the cool stuff that's happening at Wharton's Point with living shorelines, it might be also nice to kind of figure out if you were actually taking an observation today, what would be the information that you would be choosing to document, and why is that important to you? Yeah. If you guys want to talk more to us after, feel free, and we'll make sure you guys have our contact information. Thanks so much.
So we're going to move on to the living shoreline component of this, and we've got about 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 minutes. If you look to the right here, you see the mudflat that's covered by the water right now, a low marsh that then transitions into a high marsh that then transitions into undeveloped uplands, okay? And if you'll notice, the aspect or the way this faces is a little bit different. It faces that way, while our project site, which is right over here, we'll go look at that next, faces that way. The best shoreline protection is what nature gave us, which is the marshes, okay? So what we're looking at over here on the right-hand side is if you'll notice, there's only a patch of low marsh, and while we walk over there, you'll see there's a vertical cut in the marsh. That's a scarp. And that's the high marsh, and there's a disconnect between the high marsh and the low marsh on this side because of the erosion. So you can see the low marsh is on the mudflat, and we'll walk straight across the marsh over to our project site over there, and we'll take a look at that and then talk about some of the things over there. Okay? Dan, you want to add anything?
No, I just wanted to add that there is a QR code for the GMRI project here. There's a sign at most of our sites. So you'll be able to take, just hit the QR code and it'll take you right to Morgan's website where you can enter the information in through that form.
So the first thing I wanted to point out to you is one of the things that I mentioned in the presentation, which is marshes break up wave energy. We have very low wave energy today, but see where the waves are breaking? I know the tide is just about right, but there's very little wave energy getting through that low marsh right now. Okay, so that's why the low marsh and then the high marsh platform, which right now is what we're standing on, are the wave breaks for the adjacent uplands. They're the buffers. So that's why we wanted to put this project here to try to, in our minds, create a boundary so that we can kind of keep what nature put here, which is the marsh, from eroding so that the erosion doesn't go to the adjacent uplands. So this is the project site right over here. You can see the original georeef was put in over there. That's the oyster-filled bags. It hasn't moved. It's done very, very well. The marsh above it has done very, very well. This is the new section over here of georeef you can see that we put in right here. Now again, what do you notice? It's a barrier between the low marsh and the high marsh. Well, there's a scarp here already that's kind of like the barrier, but again, if I were doing this project again, I would want to take this sill and move it out on the outer edge of the marsh, the low marsh, so you have a contiguous low marsh to high marsh, and then I would have collapsed this bank naturally, which is kind of what you see behind us here, where it's collapsed. You can see how the low marsh is now transitioning up the bank onto here and then going into high marsh. That would be a nice natural feature then. So in hindsight, would be a great thing to do. You can see a little bit of scour that's occurring on the top, right over here, next to where Dan is. A little bit of scour on the back side of this. It's not terrible, but it is happening a little bit. There is a little pocket right in here, everybody can kind of, one at a time or whatever, where you can kind of see what we call end effect occurring. So this is a hard structure in a dynamic system. We tried to tuck it into this corner as best we could, but right here we have some end effect erosion occurring, because when waves hit this structure, the wave comes in and wraps around the structure and is kind of eroding the side of it. So in a perfect world, what we do is we taper this down in size into this bank so that you don't end up with like this rectangular thing. You end up with something that is much lower so the wave energy doesn't interact with it so much. Dan, you want to say anything?
No, that's a good point, Pete, to point out to particularly property owners that own along the shore. Your neighbors interested in hardscaping or armoring, be aware that this type of energy can be transported down and start eroding the shore even more on adjacent properties. So we're experiencing that now with Bunganuck, where the bluffs have been hardened and they're starting to move down. And so because of end effects. So just be aware what's going on not only on your property, but what may be going on your neighboring property that could potentially impact your property. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. There is a clause in the Natural Resources Protection Act, which is what governs all this stuff, that says you can't have an unreasonable impact on the erosion or flood hazard of a neighboring property. Unreasonable. That's a very gray area. You can find unreasonable pretty easily both ways. Maybe it was written that way on purpose, but the whole unreasonable impact, I mean, it also relates to your project can't have an unreasonable impact on the transfer of sediment from the upland to the wetland. It literally says that. But if you put in a whole armor on a slope, there is no transfer of sediment from the upland to the wetland until that bank fails, okay? So one of the things that we're working on with Maine DEP is that some properties are very at risk. Let's say you have a house and it's 30 feet from the edge of an eroding bluff, and that bluff calved off. You're going to have to do something there, okay? And you don't have room necessarily to move your house back, but you can regrade that slope a little bit, all right? And then let's say put toe stone down and then revegetate that. What we're trying to work with Maine DEP on is this material, when you regrade that to bring that angle back, typically that's always been removed from the site. What we're trying to work with DEP on is having that material then placed either at the toe of the toe stones or on the toe stones that are put in place. Why would we want to do that?
For sediment transport.
Right, so we're at least providing some sediment to the adjacent mudflat and marsh, because these things depend on the erosion. Yes, a lot does get transported around as the tide comes in and out, as the wind blows, as currents move, but think of a little cove in Brunswick. If you think about it, if one property on that cove puts up a wall, not that big a deal. But maybe their neighbors will then. Maybe their neighbors then will. And before you know it, the whole cove has armor. Then it's unreasonable. But that's not the way projects are reviewed. They're reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So when you think about it geologically, which is the way I always think about things, that to me is an unreasonable impact, but there's really no way to stop it. So that's where we turn to the municipalities and maybe their ordinances in terms of thinking about, okay, does the municipality want to, say you have to limit armoring, or in an application or permit that they get from the town, maybe they have to look at something more specifically like a living shoreline solution, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying Brunswick needs to do that, but it's something that could be considered. Because the state alternatives analysis is a little, because of that unreasonable impact clause, it's pretty easy to get around, to be honest. So anyway, yes?
This is thinking about plan habitat, though.
Totally true.
So, where's the balance of it?
Totally true. This is habitat conversion, right here.
What advantage? Yeah, does it,
Yeah.
do you think that has some benefit, or does it harm?
I think it does.
action over here?
I think it does, because what we're doing is we're creating a little bit of a more gradual slope instead of flat bottom coming straight up to here. If this was all flat, for instance.
Pete, talk about so when we first put this project in, there has been a distinct elevation change with this sediment in between the upper marsh and the lower marsh.
Yeah.
And the lower marsh is vegetating back now towards, you can see the marsh starting in here. I say 5 years and this probably will be covered all again, the lower marsh up until.
But this has to get covered with sand, or this has to get covered with mud first for that to happen.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right, and you bring up a wonderful point. A lot of this stuff is habitat conversion when you're thinking about implementing a living shoreline. For instance, we talked about, me putting, instead of putting this here, putting it out there. That's habitat conversion. We're converting a mud flat to this. Or in the example I gave on Blue Hill, they converted a whole area that was mud flat and converted it to a wetland, because the wetland is better at breaking up wave energy than the mud flat. Okay, so, but it's a great point. It's like there are balances and trade-offs that we have to consider in all of these different decisions that we make as stewards of our land.
Can I just also comment on that in regards to the shellfish? This was a lower marsh regardless down here. There was at one point there was, it transitioned into a lower marsh, but then the erosion of course blew it out, and we were getting, everybody remembers the big chunks of salt marsh that used to float around the bay. You could actually go out there with a lawn chair, put a lawn chair on at high tide, and actually sit in the sun in the middle of the bay on a broken off piece of salt marsh. So this here in general, this upper area, there's not a lot of shellfish. We see maybe ribbed mussels, not a lot of clams, but right now we're working on trying to keep the harvesters out of our lower marshes where there are clams, because they'll harvest through this, disrupting the roots and of course causing more erosion. A good point also, the reason to save some of these marshes like this is because they sequester 43 to 50% more carbon than a terrestrial forest. So this little salt marsh right here sequesters more carbon than the Brunswick Town Commons. Just this little salt marsh right here. So this is really, really important to try to save these vegetated areas and make sure that we are able to coexist and adjust and make them more resilient to the sea level rise and climate change. So,
Tim, yeah, no, that's a great point, Dan.
Did you notice anything with these being squares or rectangles and how wave action interacted with the flat face of those, as opposed to making them out of cylinders and putting the cylinders like core logs on a slope?
Yeah, no, that had not. We were worried about scour in the front of these, and you can see a little scour pocket right there. But if you go back and look at photos before we installed this thing, that's why we take photos. I take a photo from right here every time I'm at the site, and right over there every time I'm at the site. There is a scour pocket there also before. So yes, I think that has actually deepened a tiny bit. Yeah. We did not think about a different design. I originally didn't want to use plastic. Right. This is plastic. Yeah. It's guaranteed, quote unquote, by the manufacturer not to break down. I did not make that guarantee. Tensar did, that this plastic, this GOE plastic won't break down. I wanted to use derelict lobster traps filled with oyster shell. And we were told by Noah, who paid for the project, no. So
this will stay here forever, but the lobster traps would have eventually
broken down. Yep. Yeah. Yep.
Do you think the organic plastic could work in this application?
I think it could. Yeah. I do. I really do. And it would give, but again, I think the key would be not to put it here, but to put it out there, because it'll eventually break apart, and when it does, it'll probably leave a bit of a mound of oyster shell. But in the process of doing so, it may have stabilized this area behind it for long enough that this is a resilient, full, low to high marsh habitat.
Well, we saw that happen at Dana Smith's place. There was a big log out in front of the cove.
I remember that.
And that trapped sediment in behind it, and the salt marsh started to grow up right in behind that.
Yep. I remember that from the site visit, yeah.
If you knock this down, I guess you could try to mimic how it would naturally knock down.
Slump it.
Yeah.
I don't think we'll slump it. I mean, I guess what you could do is you could try to restore marsh on top of it, but I think that would, because it would only have so much sediment on top of this, it would erode rather quickly. I don't know. So, but we're pretty happy with the performance of this stuff. It's very, very resilient, and I have to say, as a volunteer, it's really easy to work with. You take this stuff, you put the baskets together, you weave them together using these little bars over here. You put them in place, put the lids back, dump shell in with either pails or wheelbarrows. We put down marsh mats and just wheelbarrowed right down and dumped into these. You close them and then you tie them with this twine. Of course, this twine is synthetic, but we put that in 2020. We have not had to touch it, not once. Not once. We've done nothing to that. You know, this could be made out of biodegradable plastic, what do you call it?
Organic plastic, no, but there's an acronym for it.
Yeah, I can't remember. This could be made. There's a consultant that's working with trying to build these out of both metal and possibly wood, both which break down over time. So I think the concept of a gabion is onto something. Again, some people don't like the look of this. I brought a group out here for Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, about 40 people, and we took a poll. Remember, like 30 of them were like, "We don't like that. We don't like the look of it." So
like
you know,
the look of the bank being gone better.
Can you address one point? You want to put the hardscape out there. I'll call it the hardscape.
yeah, low and out there, yes.
Low and out there. But you emphasize that creating any sort of physical barrier, the hardscape barrier,
Good question.
is going to inhibit that sediment transport that you need. So can you reconcile that?
Sure. I'm trying to think of a place I can put it that maintains the natural integrity of what's here and balances what's here, the natural protections that nature put here, with the need to slow down the erosion. So in putting it out there, yes, I'm impacting habitat, yes, I'm creating a barrier, but I'm creating a contiguous habitat from the upland all the way down to that spot. And the dynamic processes over there can probably handle a lot of that, while some of the processes up here become less and less energetic. So the idea of doing it down there maintains a little bit more. Yes, there's a barrier, no doubt, but it maintains a little bit more of that natural integrity of the landscape. And then potentially, if we haven't even decided all this, if it's contiguous, if there are breaks in it, there are multiple ways of doing this that then also allow sediment transport to continue. And not all sediment transport goes landward, seaward. There's a lot of sediment transport in this direction as well. So that's something we have to remember. But if we cut off the sediment supply from that up there, and in this case, this marsh is not dependent upon that, but in a lot of cases in Brunswick, along the shoreline, you have like a 15 or 20 foot fringe marsh adjacent to an eroding bluff, or a mud flat with a fringe marsh adjacent to an eroding bluff. That marsh, think about Bunganuk, for instance. There's lots of fringe marshes and pockets of marsh along there. A lot of them are depending on slumps, that process of bluff erosion, to provide sediment into the intertidal zone. And a lot of the times what happens when you get a landslide is a whole bunch of sediment will come down, and that sediment, sometimes you'll even see trees come down in that process. That block that slides down stays there for a long period of time. And then you'll see the tree die, you'll see the grasses that were on there die, and over time that block becomes higher, but because it gets lower and lower, and then the marsh starts growing on there. Next thing you know, 10 years from now, you have a marsh there, when before you just had a mud flat. So nature is converting habitats too. That's why I don't feel bad about sediment in regrading of a project, taking it, putting it in the intertidal zone. DEP for decades has been like, no, that's fill of the intertidal. I'm like, go watch a bluff when it fails and watch what happens. You'll see the amount of sediment that goes into the intertidal zone. So we're trying to replicate that. Now, if we're going to armor something, we should at least do that. States like Massachusetts, for some of their coastal eroding banks, require a property owner, if they put in a wall, require that they calculate what the recession rate of that bluff is, how much sediment annually it's providing to the intertidal zone, and provide it in perpetuity that their wall is there. So you calculate 5,000 cubic yards, that's a lot, but 1,000 cubic yards per year. In perpetuity that you have your wall there, you have to put that into the intertidal zone. So I'm not saying Maine's going down that path, but Maine is at least thinking about, if we're putting armor in places, how can we maintain some of that intertidal habitat? She asked, what is that cylinder on the end? I think that's a green crab trap.
Crab monitor trap.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you put mitigation out here, have you calculated how high it has to be?
Not yet, no. Nope. But it would have to probably be at least as high as this one is my guess. The goal is not to break up all the waves.
Right.
The goal is to dissipate the waves so that there isn't so much wave energy going through here. I don't care if the waves break out there and then continue with some energy through, but I don't want a 3-foot wave coming in and smacking against this bank, which it can do right now. 3 years from now, what would I like to see? I would like to see what we have here, still here, and I would like to see this marsh edge doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Do you think you could put like core material and organic matter in the core of these things and then try to pre-plant it?
Yeah, on the upper like 6 or 8 inches. I don't see why not. You might lose that in a storm event, but if you do it during the right time of the year, that could create a mat and then the roots take, kind of just like those other techniques. Yeah, I don't see why not. Vegetation would clearly grow up through this if it had soil. You have a little bit growing up through there that established itself.
Right.
And that's like less than a centimeter of sediment over there that's growing out of.
I think
So,
provided the media it'll take on.
I think you're right, Tim. Dan, make a note. Next
Keeping the
phase.
media in place is the problem.
Next phase.
Put it in the core of it.
Right.
Yeah. You don't mean put it in a layer on the top. You mean
In the middle of it.
With the shell.
In the middle of the basket, so it's fully protected and won't wash out.
It's sort of like
It won't get any wave. The waves won't wash it out.
kelp. You know how they do the aquaculture of kelp? They sink the lines with the seed already in the core, and
Okay.
it grows.
And it would still, you think it would still grow up through the oyster shell?
It's an idea.
Yeah, no.
But it would be there. You know,
Yeah.
right now it's got to go through this much oyster shell. But if you had that organic matter in the middle,
I'm also wondering, like, if you made 6 inches of this and had this be mudflat material and then seeded that.
over the top of that.
Yeah, no, not on top, but inside this.
Inside of it.
Yeah, like the top 6 inches or so. Maybe marsh comes out of that, I don't know.